probably lives in Bethlehem, whereas Boaz appears to be very, very wealthy, probably a landowner who lived in a compound outside Bethlehem and just maintained these fields. She said, "Please let me glean and pick out what falls from the sheaves behind the reapers." And again, I'd tell you that in Israel, that's a right, okay? She would ask basically because she's going to be there, but no one can say no to her. They could have a situation that would make her very uncomfortable being there, but legally, under Jewish law, you can't say no to her. Thus she came, and here she stayed with hardly a rest from morning until now, okay? And poor people in Israel are able to really survive in this way. The other thing about the Jewish thing is that if you're in a field, you always have the right to eat anything in the field. This gleaning is the right to carry stuff out of the field. So like if you were in an apple orchard, you have the right to eat any apples. You do not have the right to carry an apple out of the orchard unless you're gleaning, okay? And that's after they've taken harvest. So Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen to me, daughter. You must not go gleaning in any other field. You must not go away from here. Stay close to my work women." Okay? So what he's doing is basically telling her she's safe. Remember, her mother-in-law told her to find a place where she could glean safely. And Boaz is basically saying that. He says, here you're safe. I'm going to ask you while you're here to stay close to the women who are working in the fields. The women did harvesting just like men did. And so stay close to the women who are in the fields. Keep your eyes on whatever part of the field they're reaping and follow behind. I've forbidden my men to molest you. Okay? So he's provided for her safety. And I would say that the way this text is worded and what we're going to see of Boaz, he probably has forbidden his men to molest any woman. But simultaneously, in order to enforce that, what he has is that the women who are gleaning go behind women who are harvesting, and probably has men who are gleaning who go behind men who are harvesting. And it's just a safety measure on his part. I'd like you to know that if something were to happen to Ruth, it would be a very serious blight on him, no matter who did it. And that's why he sets it up that way. He says, if you're thirsty, go to the pitchers and drink what the servants have drawn. Okay? Now that's something he didn't have to do. That they had servants they paid to bring water, but the water was for the people who were working in the field. And so he gives them the water. Ruth fell on her face, prostrated herself, and said, "How have I attracted your favor for you to notice me, who am only a foreigner?" And again, remember the whole business in Israel about the fact that not to be Jewish is not to be much. And they see very, very strong favor on themselves. And so she wants to know how she's blessed. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about the way you behaved to your mother-in-law since your husband's death, and how you left your own father and your own mother in the land you were born to come to a people about whom you previously knew nothing." So what Boaz is saying, and obviously the conversation with the workman went a lot further than we saw, but the conversation with the workman is Boaz knows about Ruth. But what he recognizes in Ruth at this point is a person, I guess I would say a soulmate, because Ruth, as let's say a priestess in Moab, and a priestess is a pretty important person. So as a priestess, she would marry into this foreigner's family. And when the problems came, she held to the bond, and she held to her responsibility to Naomi, and went beyond her responsibility to make sure Naomi was cared for. Now we're watching the same thing in Boaz. Boaz has someone come in to reap. He has provided the things for the people who are in there gleaning, and he also has provided for their safety and their care. And we see in Ruth a personality of commitment and care, and we see in Boaz a personality of commitment and care. And what you see is soulmates, really. He says, may Yahweh repay you for what you've done, and may you be richly rewarded by Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to have refuge. And so he recognizes that her coming is now essentially a relationship with God, that she's entered into this relationship with God through Naomi. She said, my Lord, I hope you will always look on me with favor. You have comforted and encouraged me, though I am not even the equal of one of your workwomen. And so she says that she isn't, and to be honest, she isn't. She's a beggar. At least they're working, okay? So she isn't the equal of any of these people. And she says, but you've looked on me with favor. I'd remind you of this favor. I don't know whether we've gone through this word. It's hen hesed. Did we go through that here? Hen hesed is a Hebrew word, and it is it's translated favor. In Greek, the word becomes charism, and in Latin, the word becomes gratia, and it means gift or grace. But as it originally appears in Hebrew, it's a very complicated word. And when you fall in love with a person, you plant something in that person that's attractive to you. And that's what hen or hesed is. And that's why when we get grace, God is attached to us. We are attractive to God because of what he's placed within us. But if you study much about the dynamics of how people fall in love, they always project something into another person that really draws them. Love is... I don't like to be unromantic about it, but it in fact is a decision, you know. People sometimes make it unconsciously, but it in fact is a decision that people make, okay? He says, my Lord, I hope you always look on me with favor, for you've comforted me and encouraged me, though I'm not the equal of one of yours. He says, when it was time to eat, Boaz said to her, come and eat some of this bread and dip your piece in the vinegar. If you eat in the Mideast, the common meal they have, you can have very elaborate meals with lamb and everything, but the common meals they have are pita bread, and the pita bread is put in different kinds of dips, most of them made with garbanzo beans. And they make a paste. They'll add different spices to it, or mint or something like that. And that's basically what they eat, just normally on a normal meal. She is gathering barley, and what they will do with the barley at home, they wouldn't eat barley. What they would do with the barley is they would grind the barley into flour and make this pita bread out of barley flour. And so while she's gathering the barley, she actually has nothing to eat. And so he invites her to eat with the servants. Ruth sat down beside the reapers. Boaz made a heap of roasted grain for her. She ate till her hunger was satisfied, and she had some left over. This reference to some left over, you may remember that during the idea of the Last Supper, do you remember there's the thing where Jesus dipped the piece of bread in the dish and handed it to Judas? That if you're in charge of a meal, the way you show favor to a person is serving them or giving them too much, okay? Sort of the Italian thing. And the idea here is that Boaz is actually showing immense favor to this woman over other people. He is showing something very, very favorable to her. We're going to find out more about why later. It says, when she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workpeople, let her glean among the sheaves themselves. Do not molest her. Now, this idea of gleaning among the sheaves is she isn't following the workers now. She's right beside the workers as they're going on. He says, and be sure you pull a few ears out of corn out of the bundles and drop them. He says ears of corn. I probably mentioned to you before that the translation I'm using is a translation from England, the Jerusalem Bible, done by Toclin. And in England, the word corn means grain. It's a generic word for grain. And that's why when the settlers came and they saw what the natives were eating, they just called it corn. It just means grain. Okay? So they're told that as they're harvesting, there's to make sure stuff falls in order for these people to be taken care of. Let her glean them, do not scold her. So she gleaned in the field till evening. The reason of the scolding is, remember I told you they get to go through the field once? Well, if you get to go through the field once and you drop a little, you can pick that up as you're going on. Just go back in the field. But if she's right there gleaning, as soon as you drop it, she's got it. And the idea is she has a right to it. I think one of the things to note here is that you see Boaz as a person in caring for these people, as someone who goes beyond the requirement of the law. Like he makes sure that stuff drops for them, makes sure they have the thing, and he sees his gleaning as this responsibility. You know that we have a very different way of looking at law than either the Bible or, let's say, the Italians. When we look at law as a minimum that it hits everyone, that everyone is supposed to perform the minimum of the law. When you get to Italy regards a law as something to be striven for, that it's an ideal you get to, that it doesn't actually bind everyone. I had an incident one time when I was in an airport in Italy, and there was a man standing smoking a cigarette leaning against a pillar on which was a sign, "Thou shalt not smoke." And I guess just the way I looked, I didn't say anything obviously, just the way I looked, he said to me, he says, the reason the sign's there is, if everyone smoked, there would be so much smoke in the airport that no one could breathe. But it doesn't matter if one or two people smoke, okay? Now that's a very Italian way of looking at law. An American way would be, lock him up, okay? That would be the American way. I want you to know that the Bible looks at law actually in a very different way that sort of unites the two. The Bible sees laws as something that you and I strive for as much as like the Italians do. And then the Bible sees, having achieved it, that a holy person goes beyond the law. Because going beyond the law indicates that you're trying to meet the mind of God. Not just like, what was God thinking when he made this law? And I always think in terms of this, if you've ever been a waiter, one of the interesting things about a waiting table, you can allow it to be a very great drudgery. And a lot of restaurants, you wait on too many tables at a time, and it is in fact kind of a drudgery. But if you're in a restaurant where you actually have the ability to do it, you can very quickly figure out how people want things and what they want and everything. And they don't need to ask. You know how they do it and this sort of thing. If you ever go on a cruise, you'll notice that the waiters and stuff pick up what you want after the first couple of meals, and then you never need to be asked, do you want regular or decaf? Do you want this? Do you want that? Everyone knows that. And I like to think that in serving God that we come to that point, that we eventually come to the point that because of what God has told us, we come to know God. And knowing God, that's what we respond to rather than the laws. And that's how the Bible sees. The laws should be striven for. Having arrived at the laws, we move then into the heart of God and become this way. And this is kind of what you see, this man, what's God about? God is providing for the poor. Good, I can provide for the poor. I don't need the law about gleaning. I don't need the law about this. I don't need the law about the other. I know how to provide for the poor when I'm taking a harvest. Does it very well. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it came to about a bushel of barley. But what you would do is you would take the barley and you would hit it with straps, and barley pearls are covered with a thin shell, and the shell breaks off. You toss them in the air, the shells blow away, and then you have the barley pearls. You take them home to be ground. Taking it with her, she went back to the town. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. Ruth also took out what she had kept after eating all she wanted and gave it to her. So she gives her mother-in-law some of the food. She took the food. Remember that she had more than she could eat. So she took the food and brought it home as well as what she gleaned. Her mother-in-law said, "Where have you been gleaning today?" The idea is that obviously she's found a good place. "Where have you been working? Bless the man who took notice of you." And when she says, "Bless the man that took notice of you," she's recognizing that no one gleans this way. No one goes out to glean and comes back with a bushel of finished barley. Something's going on. Ruth told her mother-in-law, in whose field she'd been working, "The name of the man with whom I've been working today," she said, "is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by Yahweh, who did not withhold his faithful love from the living or the dead." Okay? So Naomi sees that Ruth has been blessed, but again here the blessing comes from God through this man. Okay? But the blessing is from God. And the idea here, this faithful love, when you see faithful love, that's Han Hesed again. Okay? So they could call it favor, but here they call it faithful love. This man, Naomi added, is a close relative of ours. He is one of those who has the right of redemption over us. The right of redemption is the right to marry into the family. He's a close enough relative that he could marry Ruth in the same way another child of Naomi could marry Ruth. The thing that's interesting here is that you see the part of the family that is Boaz that is very, very wealthy, and the part of the family that's Naomi is very poor, and yet they're at the same time very, very close relatives. When you read this, you wonder why that part of the family didn't take care of them at the time of the famine rather than they leave, but whatever the way it's set up. Ruth the Moabitess said to her mother-in-law, "He also said, 'Stay with my work people until they've finished my whole harvest.'" And notice it has changed from women. He told her to stay with the women, and she says to stay with the work people. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better for you, daughter, to go with his work women than to go to some other field where you might be ill-treated." And notice Naomi changes it back to women. Okay? Says work people. He said women. Ruth says work people. Naomi says women. Okay? Enforces the same thing. He says, "So she stayed with Boaz's workwomen and gleaned until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she went on living with her mother-in-law." Okay? We talk here about the wheat harvest. The wheat harvest comes after the barley harvest, about 3 weeks. And the difference is that the yield of wheat, the amount of grain you get, is much, much lower than barley, which is why barley was the one that was generally done. And you would see that the size of a grain of wheat and the size of barley. It's kind of obvious. But the fact of the matter is wheat was used by the extremely wealthy people. And so they would harvest part of their fields in wheat, but there was not a big market for it. And so they would do part of it was sold to very wealthy people. It might actually be what Boaz uses in his own home. We don't really know. But barley was the general food that the people used. Chapter 3. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, said, "Daughter, is it not my duty to see you happily settled?" Okay? Now, what we were watching earlier was the fact of Ruth's real commitment to Naomi in the whole situation. Once Ruth has made the decision to be with Naomi, then Naomi now feels that she has a real commitment to Ruth. And just as Ruth wants to provide for the future of Naomi, now Naomi wants to provide for the future of Ruth. The future of Naomi is to be cared for. The future of Ruth is to be married. And so now she sees this. And Boaz, the man with whose workwomen you were, is he not your kinsman? Tonight he will be winnowing the barley on the threshing floor. So wash and perfume yourself, put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. She's not going to work, I should point out. Okay? So what we see now is Naomi is, I guess she's a Yentl. But anyway, what she is doing at this point is matchmaking. And we're going to find out that as we get on, that when Boaz decides that he would like to marry Ruth, he's going to discover that there is a family member of closer relationship. And you have to follow the relationship deal, okay? So she's going. Now, during the winnowing and on the threshing floor, this was not really hard work. What they would do is beat the grains, as I told you, with straps. Then they would toss it in the air, and this is when the whole field's finished. And that was really a party time. They would do that up in they usually had a stone pavement in the field somewhere. And if you read in, like, the book of Gideon, when the pagans or other groups wanted to harass the Jews, they'd light their fields on fire, and the Jews would go out and stand on the stone pavement as the fire went by them. All fields have these big stone pavements just for winnowing the grain, okay? But then you bring all the grain there, you do that, and they do it sort of in a party in the evening. The real harvest is over and stuff like that. So don't let him recognize you while he is eating and drinking. But when he lies down, take note where he lies. Then go and turn back the covering at his feet and lie down yourself. He will tell you what to do, I bet. Ruth said, I shall do everything you tell me. Okay? And again, what we see in this situation is this relationship is supposed to be a union of the two families. And so Naomi is putting it together. Apparently, as we see this, Naomi does not know anyone's closer related, but she sees, the wealthy man and sees how kind he is. And so this is the situation in which she wants to be. I just point out, I don't know if you have ever read this at all, but this is a passage that Sigmund Freud commented on. And Sigmund Freud commented on it largely because of the reference to feet, that oftentimes feet is a euphemism for sexual organs. And so the idea is that, according to Sigmund, that there's something, less than visible going on here. Okay? We're going to see that is the nature of the thing, certainly. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her. When Boaz finished eating and drinking, he went off happily and lay down beside the pile of barley. Ruth then quietly went, turned back the covering at his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, he woke up with a shock and looked about him, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. Okay? Now, what happens is this idea of going to bed and then waking up with a shock, understand that in the harvest there's a lot of drinking and everything. And so that's one of the very things Naomi wanted her to do, was, to wait until he had enough or more than enough to drink. Who are you, he said, and she replied, I am your servant Ruth. Spread the skirt of your cloak over your servant, for you have the right of redemption over me. Now, Naomi had said that, and so this is what Ruth thinks. Ruth thinks that this is the next man in line. The spreading of the cloak over the person is a symbol of engagement. It was oftentimes used, they would exchange an article of clothing. The man would give some article of clothing to the woman, and it was seen as a kind of engagement. He says, May Yahweh bless you, daughter, he said, For this second act of faithful love of yours is greater than the first, since you have not run after young men, poor or rich." And so he sees the fact that she is making the advance with regards to marrying him is a continuation of her concern for Naomi. And so he sees this, what do you call it, this relationship of faithful love. She is faithful to Naomi. "Don't be afraid, daughter. I shall do everything you ask, since the people at the gate of my town all know that you're a woman of great wealth." The people at the gate of the town are the older people. We would call them the elders. And they basically, would sit at the gate of the town. Everything happened at the gate of the town. Towns were very tight, densely built in order to be protected by a wall. And so there was no space in the town. If you had an area, courts took place right out the front gate. Decisions were made at the front gate. And what we would call like assemblies of people took place at the front gate. There was no place inside. There was only, if you read the texts about Solomon's palace, there was only one really large room in Solomon's palace. And one of the things to know about that time in history, they didn't know how to make the arch. So that room in Solomon's house is called the Forest of Cedars. And the reason why it's called the Forest of Cedars, there's so many pillars inside to hold up a thing. But you couldn't have a gathering like we would in an open area like this. They simply didn't have it. So he says that the people at the gate know who she is, and they know of her significance. Anything that's done legally with regards to engagement, with regards to the proposal of marriage, with regards to any of these things, must be done at the city gate. These elders witness it, and it's basically like buying a marriage license. He says, "But though it is true that I have the right of redemption over you, you have a kinsman closer than myself." Okay? One of the things that this indicates is that even before Ruth has come to him this night, he's been thinking the same thing she is. Okay? Because he would have had to figure this out, that there's someone closer. "Stay here for tonight. In the morning, if he wishes to exercise his right over you, very well, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to, then as Yahweh lives, I shall redeem you. Stay here till morning." Okay? So he has Ruth stay there, and in the morning, what he's going to do is check out whether this other gentleman wants to exercise his right over Ruth. And I'd like you to know that the right, like for instance, if the other gentleman is married, what he needs to do is impregnate Ruth, but he wouldn't take her as a wife. And then the child that's born from that becomes the child of Naomi and carries the family name and everything. So the person who has the right, if you have the right of redemption, if you are unmarried, then you marry the party. If you are already married, what you're required to do is impregnate the party, but the child is not yours. The child is the child of the family. Okay? So